Thank you, Vice Chairman. Senator Coates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a fascinating discussion. Really appreciate the comments from all of you, particularly from Senator Gregg and supported by others, and not just the what. We've been debating what should we do for a long time now. And we've had numerous commissions and committees and so forth and so on, but also the how. Because if time is of the essence, and I think there's unanimous agreement that we need to do this now. We run into political difficulties really once we get past July. People start focusing on the next election in 14. Members are looking, what do I need to do to protect myself from the onslaught of why did you do this, and primaries and so forth. And then you're into a presidential cycle. And so that pushes real opportunities like this one into about 2017, which I think most of you would conclude is way too late. So this is the time. I mean, and this is the time to do it. And so focusing on the how do we get it done, I appreciate Senator Gregg's contributions in that regard. And the question, Dr. Rivlin, you said in your testimony, you said that comprehensive tax reform and the other reforms that needed to be made to stabilize the debt need to be simultaneous. How do we make these simultaneous? And I guess I asked that question of Senator Gregg because you were talking about the how. If we all agree that they need to be simultaneous, there's a lot of talk about, comprehensive tax, that takes a year, at least a year. It's going to take more than a year and so forth. And right now, they're separated in terms of what we need to do now. So it's discretionary and spending and mandatory now, tax reform later. So, Senator Gregg, do you have a suggestion as to how we push tax reform as simultaneously with this other effort?
I think you need an agreement that is a hybrid reconciliation bill. Probably shouldn't even be called reconciliation, but that essentially outlines in very specific language as to what the committees of jurisdictions must do and the time frame that they must do it, so that they're reporting back comprehensive tax reform and entitlement reform essentially on a time track that's very visible, very transparent, and everybody knows it has to be done. And failure to do that needs, in my opinion, a fallback position which forces action. Maybe you just take Simpson Bowles and use it as your fallback position with something like that, so that you end up with, or Wyden Coates would actually be an excellent fallback position on the tax side, so that you get something done and you have a clear pathway, and it's subject to certain rule requirements which force it to be done.
Yeah, appreciate the plug for Wyden Coates. Anybody else want to comment on that? I think the question pretty much has been answered, but let me go to a second. Michael Boskin and Adam Goolsbee testified for us just a few weeks ago. We were talking about balance, and that question has come up. Dr. Boskin said, well, there's two different types of balance. The president basically defines balance in more of a socioeconomic way. That is, if fairness requires 50% taxes, 50% spending. He said, but economic balance doesn't fit that model at all. The ratio, if you want to achieve the kind of growth that's necessary and put us on the right path and deal with this debt deficit issue, that balance needs to be, he said, 5-to-1 or 6-to-1 ratio. Adam Goolsbee said, well, at least it ought to be a 3-to-1 ratio and not lower than that. Well, currently we're either at a 2-to-1 with the political system essentially right now saying, no, it needs to be 1-to-1. What are your thoughts on that? Let me start at the other end with Dr. Johnson.
Well, on this point, I think, Senator, I disagree with Dr. Boskin. I think that, again, you have to go program by program, and I understand this format, we don't have a lot of time to do this. I did write a book on this topic. I understand Mr. Brady may not want to read that either. But if you go through what does the government do, and I think to your point, which is a very good point, what gets in the way of growth, what's good for growth, what gets in the way of growth, and what is part of a reasonable, fairly basic, compared to other countries, but reasonable system of social insurance that we've developed over the decades. When I look at it that way from the bottom up, I come to the position that while there are important changes to be made on the spending side, some of which you've already done, some of which Senator Klobuchar talked about, I lean much more towards overall The revenue side, the Bush tax cuts took about $4 trillion, looking over the decade basis that we usually do, about $4 trillion in revenue out of the system. I would seek, and this is, I was trying to dissent on your earlier question, Chairman Brady, I would seek to replace that, not immediately, not with immediate austerity, so don't please misquote me on that, but over 2 decades, I would like us to get back to the kind of revenue trajectory we were on prior to the Bush tax cuts. And then we have to look, going beyond the 2 decades, at Dr. Holtz-Eakin's chart and say, okay, what's happening to the demographics of our population, to the income-earning capabilities, to the kind of healthcare people want and hope to get when they're 95,
Thank you.
when you're out in 2050.
Thank you. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, you want to comment on that?
I mean, economic balance says revenues match expenditures, and that's the only balance that has any sort of substantive foundation. The rest is politics, and all these ratios are politics. Everyone in this town loves to talk about taxes. You know, I used to have hair, and they were still talking about taxes back then, and all we talk about is taxes. The fundamental decision the government makes is to spend the money. So I would go back to what Senator Gregg said. Design the programs, decide how large the government's going to be, do a tax reform to finance it so that the budget balances, which is something we have, a discipline we have lost in the federal government, needs to be restored.
Dr. Rivlin?
I don't see any magic in Mike Boskin's assertion that there's a specific ratio of taxes that is most conducive to growth. I think we can make our tax system a lot more conducive to growth by getting rid of the spending in the tax code or reducing it, and still raise considerable more revenue in a more pro-growth way. And I don't think it's realistic that a country with our values can absorb half again as many seniors over the next 10 years by reducing their benefits in order to get to balance that way. It's just not realistic.
My time's expired, but quick comment, Senator Gregg?
Well, I think the appropriate way to approach this is to set the size of the government as a percent of GDP. Once you've done that, everything else flows from that. Historically, it's been 19.8% with a massive expansion in retirees. Simpson Bowles agreed to go to 21.5. Somewhere between those two numbers is probably the right number.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.